Imagine being trapped in a marriage so dangerous, your every move could mean life or death, not just for you, but for your entire household. This is the untold story of Abigail, a woman whose extraordinary wisdom and courage saved her family from a terrifying fate orchestrated by her own husband. How did she survive Nabal's dark shadow? Let's listen to the amazing story together and answer the question. I was bound to a fool. His pride signed our death sentence. If I hadn't stepped into the path of David's sword, my entire household would be buried in blood. I am Abigail, and this is my perspective.
Welcome to Testament Unspoken, where we bring biblical stories to life through the eyes of those who lived them. Each episode offers a raw, first-person perspective on some of the most powerful figures in Scripture, told with emotion, honesty, and depth. Please subscribe for more stories like this.
I was bound to a fool. His name was Nabal, my husband, wealthy in flocks but poor in wisdom. We had fields, vineyards, herds beyond counting. Our name was known, but not for kindness, for arrogance, for cruelty. He was a man whose heart was drunk, even when no wine touched his lips. A man who stumbled not from drink, but from pride. They called me wise, but wisdom does not silence the ache of living beside a man like him. I was weary, bone-weary. Day after day, I carried the burden of his pride. I cleaned up his messes. I soothed offended neighbors. I hushed servants beaten down by his rage. I gave bread to the hungry when his hand refused to open. I watched him mock servants who only sought to please. I saw him crush the poor who begged for mercy. He boasted as if the whole world bent to his laughter, as if God himself owed him reverence. And I was his wife, not his partner, not his friend. I was a shadow at his side, unseen, except when he needed me to cover his shame, except when my silence could protect him from the weight of his own foolishness. Still, I stayed, not because I loved his pride, but because I loved the God who had joined us. I believed that even in my silence, God saw me. I believed that even in the shadow of a fool, I could be faithful, that somehow my life, small as it was, mattered in his hands. But one day, his folly grew too loud to hide, his words too sharp to swallow, his arrogance too heavy to bear. One day, his pride nearly destroyed us all. It was shearing time. The courtyards throbbed with noise, shearers calling to one another, bleating flocks, knives flashing, wool piling like small hills against the wall. Fires snapped under iron pots. The air smelled of fat and bread and smoke. A day for open hands, a day when a wealthy house showed its heart. Servants ran past me with baskets and skins. I moved among them, quiet, steady, the unseen keeper of order. I counted loaves with my fingers. I checked the jars. I told the baker to send a tray to the gate guards who had missed the morning meal. It was my way. Make sure those who served were fed. It cost nothing to be kind. Before noon, the messengers arrived. Word came that David, yes, David, the son of Jesse, had sent his men to us. Not in anger, not to demand, but to ask. He had protected our shepherds in the wilderness. Not a sheep was lost under his watch. He came in peace, asking for kindness in return. They came dusty from the wilderness, but they carried themselves with respect. They bowed at the threshold and asked for peace. Peace to our house, peace to our herds, peace to my husband whose name filled these hills. Their words were careful, not demanding. They spoke of the weeks our shepherds spent outside, of nights when wolves circled and thieves watched, and how none of our flocks were lost. We were not a burden, they said. We were a wall. They asked only what any house would offer on a day like this, a portion from the plenty. Bread for the men who had kept our bread from being stolen. I stood half-hidden behind a pillar and listened. I knew their master by reputation, David, the one who would not lift his hand against the king though the king hunted him, the one whose songs were whispered among the young. I had watched the shepherd boys on the hills test their slings and grin when his name was spoken. A man not perfect. What man is? But a man under a promise. I sent a glance to the steward nearest me. He understood. He always did. He started toward the storeroom. Then Nabal entered. He came flushed and loud, the way he always came when eyes were on him. He threw his arm wide and laughed at a joke no one else had made. Wine stained his lip. His robe hung open and his necklace knocked against his chest as he walked. "What is this?" he said, waving toward the men at the threshold. "More mouths to feed? More beggars from the hills?" The messengers lowered their eyes again and spoke of peace. They reminded him of custom, of honor, of the protections given in the wild. They asked for kindness fit for a great house. And my husband smiled the smile I feared. "David?" he said, tasting the name like something sour. "Who is he?" "Some runaway, some nobody. There are plenty like him. Do you think I give my bread, my water, my meat, to men who blow in from nowhere?" I closed my eyes, just for a heartbeat, long enough to pray without words. The steward stopped in his tracks. Servants shrank into doorways. The shearers bent lower over the fleece as if the wool itself could muffle the shame. The leader of the messengers lifted his face, not in defiance, only in hurt. He drew breath to try again, and my husband cut him off with a flick of his hand, a gesture as sharp as a blade. "Go," Nabal said. "Tell your master that Nabal feeds his own. Tell him find another table." The words fell into the dust like stones. This is not how a house answers on a day of plenty. Not in Israel. Not when God has given increase. Even if the men had been unknown to us, bread would have been offered, water drawn, a little oil poured, because that is what it means to fear God, to open the hand when it would be easy to close it. But these were not strangers. Our shepherds had returned safe because of them. I remembered their reports by the evening fires. No theft, no insult, no quarrel, only a ring of protection around our men whenever David's band camped near. I remembered the way the youngest shepherd said it, with relief, with sleep, finally in his eyes. I watched the messengers gather their dignity like cloaks against a cold wind. They bowed again, still respectful, even in rejection, and stepped backward into the sun. The courtyard swallowed them with its noise, yet I could hear their silence. I could almost hear what would come next, the thunder of feet, the iron ring of swords. Nabal turned from the gate, already laughing at something else, pouring more wine for men who laughed, because he laughed. He did not see the steward's face. He did not catch the way the servants stared at me, not begging, not commanding, simply asking with their eyes, "What will you do?" I did not speak. There are moments when words thrown at a fool are like sparks thrown at dry grass. I held my tongue, and the tongue burned like a coal inside me. A boy from the field slipped through the side door, breathless. He tugged at my sleeve and whispered fast that David's men had been a fence around them, that no sheep were lost, that they had been good to us day and night. "But now," he said, "now, the master has returned them insult for kindness. Evil is coming, mistress. I can feel it. Evil is coming." The words landed where the stones had fallen. I walked the length of the courtyard once, slowly as though I were only checking the baking, only counting the skins of wine, only noting how many lambs were turning on the spits. But I was counting something else. How many lives would be weighed against my husband's pride before the sunset? The number was too high to say. I know the look of men who have been wronged. I have seen how quickly grief can turn to rage when the sword is near and the heart is hot. David did not keep 4 or 5 with him. He kept hundreds. Men who had lost homes and names and safety. Men who would not endure insult lightly. If they came, they would not come to talk. I stood at the threshold where the messengers had stood and looked out toward the hills. Heat trembled above the stones. Vultures wheeled high and patient. Somewhere beyond those ridges, the dust would already be rising. I could feel the house breathing around me. The buzz of feast day, the clatter and jest that hides fear. I could feel the servants moving the way a body moves when a wound is expected. And in the middle of it, Nabal laughed again as though he had crushed a fly and not invited a storm. A thought came quiet and steady like a hand on my back. You cannot stop his mouth, but you can stand in the gap. I nodded once. To no one. To God. to the truth I could not escape, and turned toward the storerooms. That was the moment, long before I spoke to David, when my decision was made. Not out of boldness, not out of anger, out of fear for innocent blood and a trembling desire to honor the God whose name my husband had dragged through dust. Nabal had chosen pride. I would choose peace, even if it cost me everything. That night I did not sleep. The house was full of noise, laughter spilling from the feast hall, wine pouring like a river, the clamor of men who knew nothing of the danger pressing toward us. But my chamber was silent, too silent. I could hear only my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear the cry of the servant boy's warning replaying in my ears. Evil is coming. I lay awake, staring at the shadows on the wall. Every creak of the gate made me think David's men had come. Every gust of wind sounded like horses approaching. My mouth was dry, and my prayers would not form into words, only sighs, only fragments. I asked myself again and again, what can one woman do? I was bound to a husband who did not listen, a man who saw wisdom as weakness and kindness as waste. If I spoke to him, he would rage. If I pleaded, he would mock me as he mocked the messengers. And if I stayed silent, silence would be blood. I thought of our servants, their children asleep in the outer rooms, faces pressed against their mother's arms. They had no voice. They had no shield. I thought of the shepherds, weary from the fields, men who had trusted my husband's name to cover them. I thought of the flocks themselves, God's provision, entrusted to us, about to be cut down because of pride. And then I thought of David. I had never met him, but I had heard enough. I knew his name was sung by maidens after battles. I knew Saul had slain his thousands, but David his tens of thousands. I knew the king himself feared him. He was not a man to be trifled with, and he was not a man without promise. The Lord himself had set his favor on him. And so I asked myself, if David stained his hands with our blood, would that not stain the story God was writing? Would he not regret it when he became king? Would he not remember the day he avenged himself instead of leaving vengeance to God? I rose from my bed. The floor was cold under my feet. My hands trembled as I wrapped my robe around me, and I whispered the only prayer I could manage. Lord, if you have placed me here, do not let me fail. I stepped into the storerooms. Clay jars lined the walls, the scent of grain and dried figs thick in the air. My fingers moved without thinking, counting, measuring, gathering. 200 loaves, skins of wine, sheep already dressed, roasted grain, clusters of raisins, cakes of pressed figs, enough to fill the hands of men ready for war. Every loaf I touched felt like a heartbeat. Every jar of wine felt like the weight of a life. I did not think of how Nabal would rage when he discovered what I had taken. His anger was nothing compared to the wrath rushing toward us. The servants who trusted me moved quietly at my side. They asked no questions. They loaded the donkeys with trembling hands, their eyes darting toward the hills. They knew, as I knew, that dawn might bring slaughter if we delayed, and as I watched the baskets pile high, I knew my path was set. I was not going to argue with Nabal. I was not going to wait for his heart to soften. I was not going to let fear of his fury chain me in silence. If blood was to be shed, it would not be said that Abigail stood idle. I would rise. I would go out to meet the storm. I would fall at David's feet if I must. Perhaps he would hear me. Perhaps he would turn. Perhaps God, in his mercy, would use my weak voice to stop strong hands. It was a desperate hope, but it was hope enough. The donkeys brayed as we led them out under the fading stars. Their backs swayed beneath the weight of bread, wine, figs, and meat, a peace offering heavy enough to bend the shoulders of men. The night air was sharp. Each breath stung my chest as we left the gates behind. My hands gripped the reins until my knuckles ached. I dared not look back toward the house. Behind those walls, Nabal laughed, drunk and blind, feasting while danger gathered beyond the hills. The path was rough, stones loose beneath our feet. The servants' torches flickered, throwing shadows across the cliffs. Every sound startled me. The snap of a twig, the distant cry of a jackal, the rumble of hooves I thought I heard but could not see. My heart, hammered so loudly I feared the men beside me could hear it. I prayed as we walked, "Lord, let my steps be swift. Let my words not fail me. Let your hand be stronger than my fear." The closer we drew to David, the more the air itself seemed to tighten. Word had spread quickly. Even before I saw them, I knew he was coming. There is a weight when men march with blood in their eyes, a heaviness in the earth. It is felt before it is seen, and then I saw them. A line of men cutting across the wilderness, armed, fierce, their faces set like stone. Their swords caught the rising light of dawn, 1,000 tiny fires glinting against the steel. Dust billowed around their feet, swallowing the valley in haze. At their head rode David, his shoulders broad, his jaw set, his eyes locked forward. Anger radiated from him like heat from the desert rocks. He was not a king yet, but he looked every part of one. My knees weakened. For a breath, I wanted to turn back, to run behind the walls of my house and pretend I had not seen what I had seen. But I knew there was no safety behind those walls. The danger was here, and I was here. So I pressed forward. The donkeys slowed, ears twitching as the men drew nearer. My breath caught in my throat. This was it. There would be no second chance. If my courage failed me now, all was lost. I stepped out from the line of servants and ran forward. My feet stumbled over the stones, but I did not stop until I stood before David's army. They saw me, swords lifted, voices barked. A soldier shouted for me to halt, but I did not halt. I fell to my knees in the dust, robes billowing around me, hands lifted high. I could feel the earth tremble under their feet. I could see David's hand tighten on his sword. And in that moment, I knew the words I spoke next could either save or destroy everything I loved. The earth shook with the thunder of their march. The clash of steel on shields rang in my ears. Their faces were carved in anger, every man ready for blood. I was only one woman, kneeling in dust before 400 soldiers. My hands trembled as I lifted them high, but I forced my voice to rise. "On me alone be the guilt, my lord." The words burst from me, louder than I thought my voice could carry. They echoed against the rocks, and for a moment, even the hooves seemed to pause. I pressed my forehead to the ground. Dust clung to my lips. My chest heaved as I spoke again. "Do not let my husband's folly stain your hands with blood. Take this offering, I pray you. Bread and wine, figs and meat. Not enough to honor you as you deserve, but enough to remind you that God himself is your defender." I dared to lift my eyes to David. His sword gleamed inches above the ground, his knuckles white around its hilt. His men stood behind him, eyes burning, waiting for the command to strike. "The Lord will make you ruler over Israel," I cried. "He will establish your house, because you fight his battles. Do not let this day be your regret. Do not avenge yourself with your own hand. Let no blood cry out against you when the crown rests on your head." My throat ached, my voice cracked, but I poured out every word as though it were my last. "If you must take guilt, take it from me. Let my husband's shame fall on me. Only spare them. The children, the servants, the flocks, they are innocent. Their lives are not his pride." Silence. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. I could hear the creak of leather straps, the jingle of harness, the restless snort of horses. No one moved. I stayed on my knees, head bowed low. I would not rise until mercy answered. Then I heard the shift of boots in dust. I heard the rasp of steel sliding back into its sheath. David stepped forward. His shadow fell across me, long and dark against the earth, and his voice, the same voice that had sung psalms in the hills, the voice that had slain giants, broke the silence. "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel, who sent you this day to meet me. Blessed be your wisdom. Blessed be you who have kept me from bloodshed this day." His words struck me harder than any blade. They were not words of wrath, but of release, not condemnation, but gratitude. I lifted my face, and his eyes were no longer burning with fury, but softened with relief. Behind him, Soldiers lowered their swords one by one as if the weight of vengeance had slipped from their shoulders. The storm had passed, not by power, not by strength, but by the trembling voice of a woman who refused to stay silent. The storm broke, not with thunder, not with blood, but with blessing. David's sword was lowered. His men's fury dissolved into quiet. My breath came ragged, but for the first time in hours, it was not with fear, it was with relief. David reached for the gifts the servants had laid down. His hand brushed the loaves, the skins of wine, the figs, and he looked back at me. His gaze was not the gaze of a man shamed or conquered. It was the gaze of a man spared from himself. "Go up in peace to your house," he said. "See, I have obeyed your voice, and I have granted your petition." Tears stung my eyes. My lips trembled. All I could whisper was, "Thank you, Lord." Because I knew this was not my doing. I had no power to turn an army, no wisdom strong enough to silence vengeance. But God had placed the right words on my tongue. God had bent David's heart toward mercy. God had spared us that day. Behind me, I heard the servants exhale, sounds of life returning to lungs that had been tight with dread. They looked at me, not with fear but with wonder, as though they themselves could not believe what had just happened. I gathered my robe, rose from the dust, and met David's eyes once more. For a heartbeat, there was silence, a quiet understanding that this day could have ended in blood, but it ended in peace. The sun had climbed higher, painting the wilderness gold. What had been a path of death had become a road of deliverance. And as we turned back toward home, I felt my shoulders grow lighter. The burden of dread was lifted. The weight of Nabal's folly had not crushed us, not today. Peace was fragile. It might not last beyond the next sunrise, but for that moment, in the glow of morning light, I carried it like treasure. I was only one woman, bound to a fool, trapped in his shadow, my voice small, my power nothing, and yet God used me. I often wondered in the long years of silence if my life mattered, if my quiet acts of kindness, a loaf slipped to a servant, a word of comfort to a shepherd, a prayer whispered in the dark, were seen by anyone at all. But that day I learned that God had seen every one of them. He had prepared me in secret for a moment when silence would no longer do. Wisdom is not loud. Wisdom does not clamor for attention the way pride does. Pride boasts at the feast, but wisdom works in the shadows. Pride mocks God's anointed, but wisdom bows low and finds favor. I did not stop David with strength. I stopped him with humility. I laid myself in the dust and said, "Let the guilt fall on me." And God turned the wrath of a king. I learned that courage is not the absence of fear. My body shook, my knees nearly buckled, my voice cracked. Courage was not in me. It was in the God who steadied me. Courage is the choice to move forward when fear demands you hide. Courage is obedience, even when the cost may be your life. I learned that peace is stronger than vengeance. That day, blood would have cried out from the ground. Blood of servants, of children, of flocks, all because of one man's folly. But peace spoke louder. Peace was a shield. Peace became the story remembered, and I learned something of God himself, that he is not blind to the hidden ones, to the wives unseen, to the servants ignored, to the hearts weary under another's pride. He hears. He knows. He calls even the least likely to stand in the gap. The world remembers kings and warriors, but God remembers the prayers of a trembling woman who carried bread and wine into the path of an army. My name is Abigail. I was bound to a fool, but God called me wise. I was weary, but God made me strong. I was silent for years, but in the day of danger, he gave me a voice. And this is my confession. Abigail's lessons: wisdom, courage, peace, and God's faithfulness to the unseen.
If you found meaning in these stories, don't forget to share them with others and subscribe to the channel. Your support is highly appreciated. Thank you. Hit the notification button.